Okay, I think I'm going to go. Okay, right, good evening. I hope that you are back with me. I've just had to restart. I've basically, what you may have noticed, so those of you who didn't realise what happened, it seems like the stream was frozen. Lots of you were getting lag, and I think that was something to do with, well, I can't quite work out exactly what went wrong. I haven't really changed any of the settings since Sunday's event, which seemed to go through no problem. I've made sure that there's no other devices in the house that are taking up bandwidth, but hey, who knows? So what I'm going to do is, I'm not quite fully set up. What I want to do is just get the live chat where I wanted it on my screen so I can follow that. I have had to slightly decrease the output, so you may notice the quality of the video, if you are seeing anything, may not look quite as sharp as it did before. I think that may be one of the ways to basically bring things back online, is to have a slightly lower output quality. So I do apologise for that, but there's really no way around it at the moment. So where were we? I'm just checking the live chat. Some people saying yes, we're back. So good. All right, thank you, Patrick Dunbar. I can see you saying you're still seeing it. Let's get going. So we were in the middle of the Amidah prayer. I don't know how much of it you heard on the previous one, so I'm just kind of, I won't go all the way from the beginning, but let's just get started. So Amidah, this standing prayer that Jews say when they go to the synagogue during the week. This will form the main focus of the prayer service. So if you went to a synagogue during the week, this would be what you would see. Obviously that's different if you went to the synagogue on a Saturday, where the main focus would be on the Shabbat service, which includes the readings from the Torah and the sermon. It's kind of split into three sections. They're not equal size. The first and the last section are quite short compared to the middle section, which is very long. It's basically described as a series of blessings, although actually it's not just blessings which sound like something you would say about God, but actually there is petitions in there. So the first three blessings are about praising God. The middle 13, as I said, the middle section is much bigger, are really what we would call petitions, where you're asking God for something. So it's not just, God, I praise you because you are merciful, or because you created us. I'm saying, God, will you help with this? So it's a kind of petitionary, prayer. And then the last three go back to kind of praise of God, but in particular praising God for the opportunities that he presents to human beings to help us, or to help Jews particularly, to serve him in the way that he requests. Obviously that gives you a description, kind of factual description. Obviously lots of the questions ask about the significance. Really, prayer itself is significant for Jews, as it is for most religious people, because it makes them feel closer to God. It develops their relationship with God. Obviously, if prayer is a sense of communicating between God and a human being, then relationships are based on communication. It also helps build community. This particular prayer is done together in the synagogue. It's something that people can be together with, and so that builds a sense of community. Okay, let's have a look. I think that was the last of the pre-live stream questions I got. So let's have a quick look on the live chat, see if we've got any genuine questions rather than just the usual stream of supposed banter that you have going on between you. So if, as I said, if you want a definite chance for your comments to be seen, obviously you might want to take advantage of the super chat. Someone there, not that this is relevant, Daniel Garvin has spotted that I'm wearing a Seattle Seahawks top. He obviously doesn't approve, and we'll just have to agree to disagree on that. So let's go with, there we go. Esme Rowley has asked about Shekinah. Okay, so this is something from the Jewish belief section. Okay, so there's obviously the beliefs and then the practices. Shekinah, it's interesting. I went to a training session put on for RE teachers near the start of the course, and we had a local rabbi come in, and he said when he looked at the list of topics that we were being asked to study, he said he was very surprised to see Shekinah in there, because actually for most Jews it's not a term they use very often or something they really think about, but it's in there, so we have to study. It basically means divine presence. Okay, it means God being present with, or I'm going to say not with, on earth. Okay, now how does that work? Obviously Jews and Christians believe God is transcendent. They believe that he is outside of the universe. Okay, for those of you here on Sunday, you may remember that very crude diagram where I basically drew a circle that said God and a circle that said the universe, and it was quite clear that God is outside of the universe. Well as being transcendent, Jews also believe, and Christians would accept this as well, that God is able to make himself present in a particular place and time. Okay, and for Jews, they would say when he does that, that's what they call the divine presence, the Shekinah. Now, when would Jews say that that has occurred? Well, they would say in the Torah, when the Jews left Egypt, and you may remember that that's the story of the Passover, wherever they stopped and set up camp, they would set up a tent for the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so this receptacle, this box basically, although they wouldn't refer it to that contained the Ark of the Torah, not the Torah, I'm getting myself confused, which would contain the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, would be placed in this tent, and the Jews believed that God dwelt with them within that tent. God was with them, and they actually called that tent the tabernacle, which those of you who've studied your Catholic Christianity will recognize as being a place that kind of houses the presence of God. When they eventually got to Jerusalem, because you may remember after the Israelites left Egypt, and they didn't actually get to Jerusalem for another 40 years, but when they got to Jerusalem, they built a temple, and the center of the temple was where they put the ark, and therefore that became known as the Holy of Holies, that particular part of the temple. And for Jews, they believe God was present within the temple, and that's the reason why even to this day Orthodox Jews will not actually go onto the Temple Mount in Jerusalem where the temple was, because they would say they don't want to accidentally stand on the place where the Holy of Holies was, where God dwelt, because they feel that that would be disrespectful. So that's a really important belief for Jews, that God came and dwelt with them. It gives them a sense of the fact that they are God's chosen people, that he desired to be with them and to basically call them his own. So it gives them that sense of encouragement. And there's also a hint within the Hebrew that it is feminine, that the term Shekinah, if you understand the way Hebrew language works, there's a kind of feminine element to it, in the same way that in French you have male and female words. And some people say that's beneficial because it kind of balances, it provides a balanced view of God. Obviously most religions are patriarchal, certainly in the language they use. Even Christianity uses he to refer to God, and some Jews will say, well, this Shekinah, this divine, almost feminine presence, helps to balance up the image of God as being both male and female. Okay, so that's Shekinah. So thank you. I can't remember who it was who asked that. Oh, Esme, I think it was. So let's see if we've got any questions that are coming up. So let me have a look. I'm going to scroll through and see if there's any genuine questions that we have from people on the live chat. I think things may have slowed down a bit, as some people may have kind of given up after the chat went down, this live stream went down. I do remember seeing something earlier about, oh actually no, there it is, moral principle and the mitzvot. Okay, so that was Sam. Thank you for the question. I realise that I haven't yet got onto themes, so I think I'm going to finish doing the stuff on Judaism, and then we'll go on to the themes. So, and it's just at this point that my cat, for those of you who can't see, has decided to join me and just sit on me like this. For those of you who don't know, this is Domino. He likes to do this when you're working. He deliberately comes and sits on your lap and tries to get in the way. So I'm going to try and carry on regardless. So, what was I talking about? We were saying mitzvot. Yep. Okay, so let's write that down. So the word mitzvah, okay, means commandment, okay, and you may recognize that because in bar mitzvah the ceremony that you have to kind of know about, means son of commandment. Okay, so mitzvah on its own is commandment, and the plural of mitzvah, get this right, is mitzvot. And again, my Hebrew, please don't tell me off if I'm getting that wrong. I'm just not very good with my Hebrew pronunciation. Okay, so mitzvot basically means commandments. Okay, and so when Jews talk about following the commandments, they might use the Hebrew term mitzvot. So they might say it's important for us to follow the mitzvot. I don't know how long he's going to stay there. He seems to find this incredibly comfortable to just sit and watch me work. Right, so the mitzvah, that could refer to the 10 Commandments. Okay, so you've got the original 10 Commandments, the ones given to Moses, but also the 613 Commandments. If you're wondering where that number 613 comes from, if you count all of the commandments, the specific instructions in the Torah or in the Tanakh, okay, there are 613 in total. And officially, Jews should, or some Jews would say, Jews should follow all of them, that they are from God, and to follow them is to obey God. Okay. Now, as you probably know, progressive Jews or Reform Jews will say actually not all of them still apply. So earlier we were talking about the fact that not all Jews would strictly follow the Shabbat laws, so they might say, oh, it doesn't, we can drive if it helps us get to the synagogue, we don't have to, necessarily keep to that commandment. And then there would be others who would say that they do have to follow all of those. Obviously, Orthodox Jews would say you have to follow all of those laws regardless. Okay. Now, there's a question that has come up in one of the, I think it was in one of the sample papers or in one of the textbooks, where it talks about, well, why do Jews follow the mitzvah? Why bother following these rules that were set in stone 2,000 or 3,000 years ago? What good can it do? And there's a few different answers that Jews will give to that. So some Jews will say it's simply about obeying God. Okay, if you believe in God and you say I want to obey God, and God says do this, then you do it. Okay, if you some would say actually the rules themselves are good for you, that actually following those rules will make your life better. They will actually, if you follow the Sabbath rules and you rest one day a week, that's going to be good for you. It's a sensible thing to do, and it helps you kind of get some relaxation. Okay. And then there would be some who say it's about recognizing your Jewish identity. So the following of the rules is simply the Jewish traditions that need to be preserved and help you feel like you are part of the Jewish religion, part of the Jewish people. Okay. I will also quickly mention here, I'm going to put this on a new slide, mitzvot and free will. So kind of following on from that question of why, there's an assumption there that Jews have free will. Okay, so Jews would accept the belief in free will, say, God sets rules, but we don't have to follow them. And really, the question is, well, how far does free will extend? Does free will mean you can do whatever you want? Well, personally speaking, that's just a simplification. If someone says to me, oh, you can't tell me not to do that, I've got free will, I can do whatever I want, we tend to realize straight away actually there are limitations to free will. Okay, firstly, I can't do whatever I want. So I could say I want to fly, but I can't. I simply don't have the physical capability. But there are limitations to free will which we kind of are imposed on us either by others or ourselves. So for example, I might set myself an ethical code that says, I do not want to deliberately cause harm to other people. So that means that stops me from doing certain things. That means I'm not going to deliberately steal from someone. I'm not going to deliberately physically attack someone, because I've imposed on myself a limit to my free will. I could do those things, but I'm forcing myself or imposing on myself a reason not to. I could also argue that actually I'm choosing, or I don't do those things because I know that there are consequences if I choose to do them. If I know that if I go and attack someone physically, the likelihood is that they will complain to the police and I will end up facing some kind of punishment. My free will would have let me do that, but that kind of imposition from other people stops me from doing that sort of thing. Okay, all right, let's see if we can get another question. that has come in. I think what I will do, actually no, I'm going to move on now to the themes. We've spent a lot of time on Judaism. I'm going to move on to the themes. I'm going to start off with this particular question, and I think I'm going to take this opportunity to move Domino on. It has been nice having you. Say goodbye to the nice lovely people. Yeah, he doesn't really care. And you can go down there and hopefully go get some food from downstairs. Right. So this question, this statement came in from someone called Connie, who also uses the avatar, or not the avatar, but the kind of name Boiled Carrots. I'm sure that's some kind of private joke that you get and we don't necessarily need to know. And she gave a 12-mark statement. So I thought this was a good opportunity to combine some subject knowledge, but also remind ourselves about the technique for answering these 12-mark questions. So, if you remember from Sunday, if you weren't here, then I'll quickly remind you. Broadly speaking, when you get a 12-mark question, there are 4 parts to your answer. You need to give reasons for that statement or reasons in favour of that statement. You need to give reasons against. You need to refer to a religious perspective, and you need to give a personal conclusion. So in this particular question we have, in Christianity, men and women should be treated the same. So this is a nice statement. I think, again, this actually was in one of the sample papers, so perhaps that's why it's come up this evening. This is really asking about the different attitudes to the role of men and women, and also the issue of equality. And this is where, in those 12-mark questions, you have to kind of not read between the lines, but you have to be smart in trying to understand what are they actually asking for. So if you notice in this statement, if you can make it out using the low resolution I'm currently streaming on, it says men and women should be treated the same. It doesn't use the word equality, but this is really a question about equality, okay? Male and female, or attitudes to male and female. And it's specifically talking about in Christianity, okay? Notice that at the beginning, that makes this a very different question. If it just said men and women should be treated the same, that's quite a different argument to in Christianity, men and women should be treated the same. So let's have a look at the reasons why we might be in favour of that. I think this is quite, I'd say it's easier to agree with this statement than disagree. I think we live in a society where we recognise the equality of all people, and therefore arguing for equality should really basically be easier to do than to try and argue against it. Okay, so arguments in favour based on the fact that all are equal because all are made in the image of God, okay? And I could expand on that. Obviously, I wouldn't just write that one sentence. I could expand on that, explain exactly what that means, maybe give a religious source that tells me where that comes from, okay, i.e. Genesis. I could also talk about the fact that Jesus treated women with respect. So in the Gospels, Jesus goes out of his way to treat women with respect. He shows much more respect to women than probably a lot of the people at the time did. You know, he talks to the Samaritan woman at the well. He has lots of female disciples. The first people he appears to are women. So again, I could write Jesus treated women with respect. That wouldn't be all I write. I would develop that with my examples and explain it, okay? I could then appeal to more secular ideas. I say, we live in a society that creates equal, or not creates, that believes in equal opportunities, okay? That phrase, opportunities. So we believe in the idea that everyone has equal opportunities regardless of sex or gender. I'm not going to get into the whole debate about the difference between those two this evening. So I've already come up with 3 reasons there, each of which I could develop into a kind of semi-paragraph on its own. Okay, what are the reasons against this? Well, at this point, I'm quite glad the statement says in Christianity, men and women should be treated the same, because if it didn't, this would be really hard. I think it'd be really hard for any reasonable person to argue men and women should not be treated the same without any other reason. That would seem quite, well, very contrary to the way society tends to think at the moment. But we've got that in Christianity. So that gives me a bit of a get-out clause, because what this is really asking, and again, this is where knowledge helps because the question itself doesn't say this, but what this is really asking you to think about is, should women be able to be priests? That's really the only example within Christianity where men and women are clearly treated differently, is the attitude to whether they should be able to lead a church. So that's really what we've got to get to. So what are the reasons why some people say no, men and women shouldn't be treated the same, i.e. there are roles that women cannot fulfill. And that's what we're going to say. So some, and again I'm going to say some because we know this is not by all means a large group. So some Christians think women cannot be priests or lead churches, because not all churches use the word priest. Okay, why do they believe that? They would say, I don't need to put this, Jesus only had male apostles. So if we remember from Sunday, the apostles, the 12 of them, were appointed by Jesus, not coincidental. Okay, if you pick 12 people at random, the chances that all 12 of them happen to be male just by accident is probably about 1 in a few thousand. Okay, so it's not a coincidence that Jesus chose only male. Obviously there's a reason why that is the case, and we could easily evaluate that, but for the moment some people say Jesus chose only male apostles, and priests follow that tradition that has been handed down. So it's a tradition handed down to always have male priests. You could add to that, there are some who think male and female have different roles to play in the church or even in society at large. So some Christian groups would say actually there is a traditional, I'm going to put in inverted commas here because that's not always the best argument. They would say it is traditional for the man to be the person who goes out to work, the woman to be the person who is the bringer-upper of the children, and some people would say that possibility, that setup is actually divinely ordained and that should be the way things are. Others would disagree with those arguments, so I could think of some reasons to disagree with those arguments. I could say, well, Jesus only had male apostles because at the time he was in a patriarchal society. You could say the traditional role of men and women, with the man leading and the female being at home, that's actually a relatively modern idea that was popularised by the Victorians. So there are reasons against that, and what I've just done there is an example of evaluation. I've started to assess the quality of those arguments. Now, this is where the farm model, which I've been using, so this for against religious conclusion, actually that shouldn't say conclusion, that should say my conclusion, which is where we get the M. So this farm model, for against religious my, this is where it can begin to fall down a bit, which is why I say it's sometimes a bit simplistic. Actually, I've already given some religious ideas, okay? If you look up here, I'm going to highlight, I've already talked about the image of God. I've already talked about Jesus. I've talked again about Jesus. I've talked about apostolic tradition. I've talked about the church. So I have already, in my answer, referred to quite a few religious ideas. So it's not like I can then suddenly add more in now. That's because of the nature of this question. Okay, if the question hadn't said in Christianity, if it had just said men and women should be treated the same, maybe my arguments here would not have been very religious. I would have just done lots of secular reasons for agreeing with equality or disagreeing with it. So in a sense, it's quite difficult now to add my religious arguments. So I might at this point kind of just recap what I've said and say, well, it's a question of the role of women in ministry. Okay, really it comes down to, did the fact, or rather not did, does the fact that Jesus chose male only apostles still have relevance today? Okay, and then obviously the conclusion is where you then say which side of the argument you fall down on. Obviously I'm not going to do that here. That's not really going to help you in any way. It's for you to kind of come up with your own opinion on that anyway. Okay, right, we've covered a little bit of the themes. Let's have a look through the live chat, or actually, right, why don't I appeal to Twitter, which seems to be slightly better at following whether there are any genuine questions. I think the live chat is a little bit unreliable, as there's a lot of stuff going on there that isn't really relevant to the subject. So I'm going to go onto my Twitter and see if I can find any questions relating to the themes. We've got relationships and then social justice. Okay, Camille talks about, so this is Camille 5 minutes ago, said, can you please look at the Catholic Church's view on the nature and purposes of the family, please? Your cat is really cute, by the way. Thanks. Nature and purpose of the family. Good question. So the nature and purpose of the family, you could say the family is basically like a mini version of the church. It is a group of people who exist to support and love and care for one another, modelled on the Trinity, which is itself a community of support and love and unconditional love and support. More specific than that, you could say that the role of parents is to be the educators of their children. Family is the place where children are brought up, they are educated, they are taught the difference between right and wrong, and they are brought up in the faith. Okay, so that's the kind of key idea, is bringing up of children, teaching them right and wrong, or helping them develop their conscience, and to, what did I say was the other one? To bring them up in the faith, so to help them receive the sacraments and hopefully grow to become faithful Christians. Okay, that was and then obviously the nature of family is also the place where children are created and brought up. It's also seen as kind of the building block of society. The church would say that the better treated families are, the better society will do as a result. Okay, let's go back and look at some more questions. I'm going to look for some that are specifically about the themes. Before, if we run out of questions on themes, then I might just go back to the Judaism stuff, which I think perhaps is more interesting for people. Catholic attitudes to poverty. Okay, that's a question from Vicky. Came in a minute ago. Catholic attitudes to poverty. I'm going to put that in a wider context for you, Vicky, because actually you are required to know different attitudes to poverty. So we'll compare the Catholic attitude to some different attitudes. So basically, the Catholic attitude to poverty is that poverty itself, in terms of how it's caused, is a problem for everyone to be concerned about. So really, the church would say, in reality, there is enough resources in the world to be shared around, and really there should be no reason why some people are in poverty and some people have a lot of wealth. Attached to that is this idea of the stewardship of wealth. By the way, let me know if you would like me to be typing notes as I do this. At the moment, I'm just kind of doing this straight to camera. If it would be helpful for me to write some stuff on screen, maybe put that in the live chat, and I'll try and do that. What was I saying? So stewardship of wealth. So Catholics believe that actually the way we can avoid poverty is to ensure that those people who have wealth, so those people who have more than they need, are able to share some of that, not all of it, but some of that with those who do not have enough. Okay, so we've kind of got those who have much more than they need sharing some of that to those who do not have enough to kind of equal things out. Now that isn't necessarily meaning everyone should have the same. I don't think the church, well, the church certainly would say we're not advocating a communist society where everyone has the same. You know, there's various problems with that, but certainly a more equal society where those who have excessive amounts share it. And that's what stewardship of wealth means, actually using your wealth to help those who are in need of support. And then that links onto this other issue of kind of what are the best ways to tackle poverty. There was a question in one of the assessment materials about whose responsibility it is to tackle poverty. Well, the Catholic Church tends to take the view that actually poverty is the result of kind of structures in society that disadvantage certain groups of people. So they tend to be of the view that poverty could happen to any one of us, and therefore if we were in poverty, we would want other people to help us. You know, that's the kind of golden rule, treat others how you would want to be treated. And so if we were unfortunate enough to be born in a place where, due to whatever situations were beyond our control, whether it's the climate or corruption or whatever, that we would want people to help us. Not necessarily to give us a handout, but to help us to help ourselves. So the Catholic attitude is very much to support those in poverty by tackling the causes of poverty and also directly helping people in need. Some non-Catholics might take the view and say, well, actually poverty, it's a choice, but it's people's own responsibility to make the best of what they have. And so, you know, if I walk down the street and see someone homeless, I might be quite cynical and say, well, they didn't work hard enough in school, or, you know, they must have, you know, burnt their bridges with all their family because no one else wanted to help them, or whatever else reasons I might come with it, and say it's not my responsibility to help them, it's society as a whole, or it's the government who should help this person, I don't need to. So various different approaches to that. There's a lot of interrelated issues there to be covered. Right. Amy Parry asks, can you go over divorce for theme A? Yes, I can. Divorce. A few people saying type notes. Okay, let's try and keep up with a few notes. So I'm going to cover divorce. So divorce itself, legal ending of a marriage. So a divorce is where a court decides that for reasons put forward by one or both of the partners, the legal marriage that exists between these two people should come to an end. And there's various laws about what you have to be able to show. Most divorces these days come under the grounds of irreconcilable differences. In the old days, before 1967, you had to prove that either your partner had been violent or that they had had an affair. These days, you don't necessarily need to prove those things. Now, in terms of Christian attitudes to divorce, you've basically got the Catholic view is they don't do divorce. Basically, there is no such thing as a Catholic divorce. Okay, if you marry in a Catholic church and you then went to your priest and said, you know, when you married me, you know, however long ago, and we made those promises and you said, I now declare you man and wife, can you undo that? The priest would say, no, you made a promise and therefore you need to keep that promise. You meant it. You said until death do us part, and that's all there is to it. Okay, there's a couple of kind of, not exceptions, I'm not going to use that word, but kind of provisos or alternatives that might be relevant. But again, I wouldn't say either of these constitutes a Catholic divorce, as it were. I would say a Catholic divorce doesn't exist, it's non-existent. So what are the alternatives? Well, there is such a thing as an annulment, okay, and to annul something means to declare it null and void. Okay, it's not a word you use very often in society, but basically what this says is there was not a genuine marriage in the first place. Or in fact, instead of the word genuine there, I'm going to use the word valid, because that's used elsewhere in the specification. So what this means is the church says that for your marriage, if you in a few years time meet someone and you go to the local church or want to get married, there are certain conditions that have to be met. You can't just turn up on a Sunday and say to your priest, oh, please can you marry me? I've got my fiance here, let's go. Firstly, there's a few legal hurdles you have to fulfill. You have to prove that you're not already married, that you meet all the criteria. And the same is true for the church. They will want to know that you've not already married someone else, okay, that you are of the correct age to marry, that you actually genuinely love each other, that it's not a marriage of convenience for, you know, a job, what's the word, job permit or whatever that might be. You have to fulfill all those criteria for it to be valid. If they are all met, then you can get married. Great, off you go. An annulment is where the church says, actually, when you got married, one of those conditions, or more, at least one, was not actually correct, that one of them was missing. And that can be on a number of grounds. The most common is where if you could prove that your partner, from the very beginning of the marriage, was never intending to remain faithful to you, then that would be grounds for an annulment. So if you could somehow show that perhaps they already had an affair, even when they got married to you, that they were already seeing someone else and clearly didn't mean it when they said, oh, I plan to be faithful to you all the days of my life, then that would be grounds for an annulment. Another example, if you knew and could prove from the beginning that one of the partners never intended to be open to having children, despite saying in the marriage ceremony that they would, that too would be grounds for an annulment. Okay, so an annulment is not, I repeat, is not a divorce. It is a statement that there was no marriage in the first place. A divorce can only exist when there is a real marriage. Okay, so that's divorce. That's the Catholic view. Basically, the Protestant view is different. They would say, actually, divorce is okay, although they would say it's not a great thing, but it is sometimes the lesser of two evils. In other words, if someone is in a horrible situation and actually they're at harm, or there's people who are at risk by being in that situation, then that may be the lesser of two evils. It may in fact be the most loving thing to do, is to allow that couple to end their marriage and to go their separate ways. Okay. Right, let's have a look. Lots of questions coming in on Twitter now. That's about Islam. Sorry, I know I've got loads of questions from you guys wanting to do Islam. I'm afraid I don't teach it at the moment. I do hope for next year to do some research and do some videos for people who study Islam, but that's not going to help you guys unless you're in year 10 and you're watching this for some reason because you've got nothing better to do on a Tuesday night. So sorry about that, but I wouldn't, to be honest, I wouldn't be able to answer a lot of those questions right now. So even if I wanted to, let's see if we can find. Please, this is Bertie. Please, can you go through the same-sex marriage? Please. Okay, so same-sex marriage, same-sex relationships. Let's have a look at that. I'm just going to start off with a subheading so I know to stay on track. I'm just going to quickly remind myself because what we're asked to study has changed slightly from the old spec, and I'm just going to make sure I don't say stuff that actually is not part of the new spec on this particular issue. So we have, make sure I've got this absolutely right. So that's to do with gender discrimination. And then we have, oh, where's it gone? Yes, Catholic views. Yeah. So, same-sex attraction. So, make sure we know what we're talking about. So, homosexuality is to be attracted to someone of the same sex. I'm going to use the term sex rather than gender in this situation, just to keep things simple. Broadly speaking, attitudes in society have changed. So, in 1967, which seems to be a very important year in terms of law, before 1967, homosexual acts. So, if two people were caught committing a homosexual act, then they could be prosecuted. It was against the law, and the majority of people in society agreed with that as well and were quite happy with that view. Just checking something on the live chat, that's fine. Then I've lost my train of thought. So yes, most people were against homosexuality. In 1967 it was decriminalised, obviously, so some people were starting to change their attitudes, and that change in attitude has continued through to today. So progressively rights and laws relating to homosexuality have been either got rid of or changed. So as of around about 2013, 2014, we could realistically say that homosexuals have complete equality under law, in that they have the freedom for protection from discrimination, so it's a protected characteristic. They also have marriage equality. In fact, recently there's an argument that it's gone so far because actually civil partnership, which was created before equal marriage, was kind of put in place as a kind of halfway house, now still exists only for homosexual couples, and I think there's a heterosexual couple somewhere who are campaigning to get that changed. Anyway, that's slightly beside the point. So we basically have, in society, we have kind of equality, and generally the majority of people are supportive of homosexual relationships and so on. How does that compare to religious views? Religion, which some would say reflects society, some would say leads society, certainly hasn't been as quick to change its mind on this particular issue. We are starting to see that. So some of the more liberal Christian groups, so certainly the Quakers, have come out and said, oh, that's a bad choice of word. They have said that they support homosexual relationships and they're willing to perform gay marriages. You have some people within the Anglican Church who are starting to talk about using that language and open to that idea. You also have some prominent Christians who are also homosexual speaking out and talking about their story. I'm thinking of one particular person whose name has completely slipped my mind. She was quite a well-known Christian songwriter who recently came out, and again, that's starting to see people change their attitudes even within the church. However, and you all know there's a kind of however there, the Catholic Church's view is still very much, certainly officially on paper, would say that homosexuality is not part of God's plan for humanity. They would take a very perhaps traditional view in saying that God created male and female to create family, and that is a kind of ordained view of God, and that's the way things are meant to be. However, they would still say that any discrimination or negative treatment towards people who are homosexual certainly must be condemned, basically, that Catholics shouldn't be resorting to that sort of treatment. Some would argue that saying what they said, saying that they believe that they're not equal, is equal to some sort of prejudice anyway, so it's a bit of a difficult one there to kind of argue for. But that's basically the view. You've got traditional religious groups saying we believe that homosexuality, because it can't create life, can never be considered part of like the kind of natural order of things. And then you've got those who'd say, well, actually all those arguments that were given against homosexuality in the Bible, they're not really relevant, society's moved on, that kind of thing. Right, let's have a look. What other questions are we getting? More on love and relationships. Okay, let's see what else. Oh, theology of the body. Yes, I said I would get to that. A few people said that early. So this, I was quite happy to see this in the new spec. I think actually it was a refreshing take to have on the whole kind of relationships issue. So the theology of the body, how do you sum it up? It was a collection of teachings. Let me just write some notes on this, sorry. So theology of the body, I realised I didn't really write anything down about same-sex marriage. I just kind of talked about it and then didn't really write anything. I do apologise. So theology of the body was a group of teachings by Pope John Paul II. Okay, so Pope Francis is the current Pope. Before him was Pope Benedict. Before him was Pope John Paul II, okay? And he was writing in the kind of 70s and 80s. Now, this is where a bit of a cultural history lesson helps. So the 60s, you may have even heard them referred to as the swinging 60s, was a time of massive change and revolution in people's attitudes towards sex and relationships and pretty much all that sort of area. And while the majority, or certainly a lot of people in society, seemed to welcome those changes and said, you know, we're getting rid of some of the attitudes of the past that held people back and, you know, were quite restrictive, there were some who kind of worried about the implications of what was going to happen, and would we as a society suffer because we suddenly had this supposedly very tolerant and permissive view of what sex is, and, you know, very kind of unrestricted view. And it took time for some of those ideas to be reflected on in this like late 70s, early 80s. So after a decade or so of some of these things, so, you know, the kind of free love movement and, you know, the availability of artificial contraception, Pope John Paul II reflected and started saying, basically arguing that society had replaced love with lust. Okay, that was kind of the theme of what he was getting at. He was saying, so he was kind of saying we've become obsessed with lust, okay, rather than love. And he was basically trying to persuade people in a positive way. He was trying to frame this as a positive argument, saying, look, if you just focus on lust, which is really about, so lust is different to love. Love is where you want the best for the other person. So when you truly love someone, you're willing to say, I will do anything for this person. I will lay down my life for them. Whereas lust says, I want this person to do stuff for me. I like the way this person looks, and I think it would feel nice for me to be in a relationship with them. And that's not just referring to kind of physical lust in the sense of sexual gratification, but it's also talking about, you know, people who get into relationships because having that person as their partner gives them status or gives them popularity. So what St. Paul, not St. well, he is now St. John Paul II, warned again. He basically warned against treating people as things. Okay, he said actually we must treat people as people and never treat them as things. And when we treat them as things, what we're saying is this person, this thing, will give me something that will help me feel better. Okay, whereas treating people as people is where you want what's best for them. So it's a very different, he would say, it's a vastly different view, and he would say true love, it never treats people as things. It treats people as people. It basically wants the best for them, and therefore that's what you should be doing. So that's really the themes of what he's talking about. He does also kind of go into how he believes that marriage is the place where that is best observed. That if you want to experience true love and know what that feels like, then you have to put yourself in a permanent, unitive, committed relationship where you have declared that and you've sought kind of legal recourse to that as well. So he's basically saying marriage is what provides that. Okay, so that's really theology of the body. Right, not seeing many questions coming up on the super chat. Lots of people just, again, it's a real insight into the teenage mind to see the sort of things you guys talk about. I'm getting much more realistic and genuine questions here on Twitter. So let's go to Dana. Do the work of CAFOD and Christian Aid. So this is part of the Social Justice and Human Rights Unit. It also is useful because CAFOD, I say it's useful now, it's kind of been in past, but CAFOD is part of the Creation Unit, but you've done that already, so it doesn't really matter. So when we talk about CAFOD and Christian Aid, we're talking really about kind of Christians working or putting their faith into action. So I spoke earlier about how Christians generally believe that poverty is something that we should all fight. Okay, and that... oh, sorry, I've just got distracted by something on the live chat. This happened on Sunday. Various people claiming to represent the London Metropolitan Police or the Greater Manchester Police and saying that they're monitoring the chat. I don't know for certain, but I'm pretty sure that's fake. Okay, if it's not, I'm happy to be proven wrong. And if a member of the Greater Manchester Police or the Metropolitan Police want to get in contact with me to prove me wrong, then please feel free. But I'm pretty sure that's someone just pretending for whatever reason they decide to pretend. So I wouldn't say ignore it, but yeah, I don't think that's real. But anyway, that distracted me. So CAFOD, Christian Aid. These are two Christian charities who basically seek to tackle injustice. They basically say poverty exists when there is people who do not have their basic human rights met. So their right to food, to shelter, to healthcare, to education. These basic human rights that the United Nations have said should be available to everyone. Where there are places where that doesn't happen, Christians are called, and CAFOD and Christian Aid in particular, put themselves in those positions to try and meet the needs of those people, to try and make the world a fairer place. And obviously they can do that on one level where they simply just go out and meet the needs of people, so they build wells and they feed people. But there's also the kind of underlying causes. So both CAFOD and Christian Aid, as well as actively going out to places and helping people, they also challenge governments, and they have lobbyists and people who encourage others to kind of actively lobby their local MP to help bring in bigger changes. Because yes, we can all kind of give money to charity and do little bits, but actually if the society as a whole, if the governments and the United Nations aren't doing their part, then in some ways it can really stop us from being able to make much of a difference. Okay, let's get some more questions. Nothing coming up on the super chat, so I'm going to ignore that. Just in case, I'm going to put it out there. If you would like to donate on the super chat, because I don't really want people think I'm doing this to kind of make money off it and do whatever, I have said that any money that I make will go straight to my Saturday football team that I play for. We need a new kit this year, so any money I make I'm going to put through to that. So if you want, just because you want to get a mention on there or you'd like someone to say your name, then please feel free to do that. I will do my best to kind of cover all of those. Right, lots more questions coming in on Twitter. That's Judaism. I might go back to Judaism in a bit if people start to run out of questions on themes. Lots of these, in fact, lots of these on Judaism. So I might just do a couple more on themes, and then I'm going to go back to Judaism for a bit. So let's go with wealth of the church and the nature and the purpose of marriage. Okay, where's that gone? Someone asked that and now I've lost the name. So wealth of the church, yeah, that's a really good one. So the church is quite wealthy. It owns a lot of land. Kyle Curran, thank you for your donation. You get a quick mention. The church owns a lot of land, a lot of property, a lot of artifacts. Barnabas, yes, I will go back to Judaism soon. Thank you, Barnabas. And so some people, quite rightly, I think it's an honest question to be asked, would say, well, you're encouraging your followers to give to charity and help. Hold on, if you sold all of this and put this into action, you could do a lot more good. The Catholic response would be to say, well, actually, the church already is the single biggest provider of charitable work in the world. Okay, so the idea that the church is sitting on this money and there are other organisations doing more is probably inaccurate. The church is the largest single provider of charitable work around the world. Yes, it does have a lot of wealth on paper, certainly. I haven't looked at this probably in as much detail as I'd like to, but my understanding is that firstly, some of the items that they've been given that are very expensive have been given to them in trust, which basically means the person who donated to them says, I don't expect this to be sold, I expect this to be used so people can come and look at it and be inspired and so on. So a lot of things that are in the Vatican Museum, they're not allowed to sell. It's been given to them and they're not allowed to sell it, which is probably a bit frustrating. The other point, why doesn't the church sell more? Well, actually, the church already is selling off a lot of its pieces of art. So those that they can sell, they are. But they've understood that actually if they were to sell it all at once, because the way the art world works, that would devalue everything, so they wouldn't get as much money. So there is a program they're going through of selling off pieces of art. Sometimes they sell it and then the people who buy it say, but you can keep it in the museum so people can still look at it. A lot of the property and the land that they own, yes, is very valuable, and I think there's decisions taken on that in terms of, well, they could sell it all and make it an initial amount of money, but then that money would then eventually be used up and they wouldn't have anything left. So I think there's a sensible way of managing, keeping hold of some and generating revenue that can then be given. I don't think that's the greatest answer in the world, but it is kind of gives you some of the technical specifics for it. Okay, I think we're going to go back to Judaism, seeing as that's what people were asking for. So if you have any questions on Judaism, I want you either to tweet them to me or I would like you to put them on the live chat. Again, if you want them to definitely get my attention, you will need to put them on the super chat. Let's start with, right, firstly, I'm going to have to apologise to Wendy. Wendy got a mention on Sunday, and since Sunday, every time I've walked near any of my year 11s at school, they've thought that they should mention your name. So Wendy, I'm presuming your surname isn't Bendy, but nice rhyming Twitter name there. I do apologise if you've received any unwanted attention as a result of my mention. You have asked about support to the family by the local parish. So what you're getting at there, this is the last question I'm going to do on themes, and then I'm going back to Judaism. So support for the local family, support for the family by the local parish. So the parish kind of puts on child groups, so toddler groups, youth groups, which help with the upbringing of children. They also can provide counselling for families. They obviously run classes for sacraments, so they help support people who are getting their children baptised or confirmed or taking their first Holy Communion. They also, they do groups for the children, youth groups, that so on, support, counselling. I think that's probably the main things to worry about for the moment. Right, let's go back to Judaism. So Keith asks, can you talk about the significance of Jewish festivals? Okay, so there are basically 3 festivals that you need to talk about, certainly for the AQA course. I'm just going to go back to these in my notes here so I make sure I don't get anything wrong. The main one is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So they're kind of a pair, they go together. So Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year. Okay, I couldn't tell you exactly where in normal calendar it falls. I think it moves slightly because Judaism follows a lunar calendar rather than a solar calendar. But it is the start of the Jewish New Year. I believe it's 10 days long, and the final day is Yom Kippur. So it's a bit like Advent and Christmas, where Advent is a period of time which ends with Christmas. So Rosh Hashanah is a period of time which ends with Yom Kippur. As it's a New Year festival, a lot of the themes, the symbolism is about renewal, about starting again, starting over, starting afresh, looking back at the last year and kind of trying to make amends, and then looking ahead to the new year. Jews believe that God is their judge, that he is able to basically weigh up what they have done in the last year, and from that make a judgment as to kind of what their year will be like to come. It's not quite as what's the word? So for example, I wouldn't necessarily say in Buddhism there's a belief in what we call karma, which is the idea that actions have consequences, and if you do good things will happen. It's not quite as legalistic as that in Judaism. They would say it's kind of God kind of weighing up what people have done and then kind of letting that influence what will happen in their future year. So one of the things that Jews do during this time is to reflect on, well, what have I done in the last year? Have I lived a good life? Have I done the right things? Have I followed the law? Have I obeyed the Torah? Have I prayed? And if they feel that on any of those things they haven't quite done what they should be doing, then they will tend to do actions that try to show God that they are sorry for those things. Okay, and that all culminates on Yom Kippur, which is really referred to as the holiest day of the year in Judaism. It is the kind of referred to as the Day of Atonement. Most Jews will spend most of the day in the synagogue. It is a day where they will fast. They will often wear white. They will do lots of things that kind of give the impression that they are repenting. They're asking God to forgive them and to show mercy. Because as well as believing that God is a judge, that he is able to judge their actions and he knows what they are, he is also merciful. Okay, and that's kind of sometimes a bit of a balance that they have to try and get right. So kind of believing that God will judge us, but he also will be merciful if we are willing to ask for his forgiveness. So that really is what those two festivals are. The other major festival that you need to understand is Pesach, okay, or Passover. This is probably one that's easier to feel familiar with, especially if you've studied Christianity, because Christians also recognise the importance of Passover because it is linked to the Last Supper and then Easter and all those things. So you probably know a bit more about this one than you do about Rosh Hashanah. So Passover, the Israelites were slaves. They were in Egypt. They were held under control by the Pharaoh. Moses, who was an Israelite but had murdered an Egyptian and kind of gone off into the desert, was then called by God. God said, I want you to go back. I want you to free the Israelites. And he goes to the Pharaoh and says, would you mind terribly if you let the slaves go? And Pharaoh says, why on earth would I do that? They're a free form of labour who helped me build a mighty kingdom. And so he says, well, God's going to send you some punishments, some plagues to make you change your mind. Eventually, on the 10th time of asking, when he basically has the death of the firstborn son, the Pharaoh relents and says, fine, be gone. And the reason the Jews don't suffer from that plague is because they are told to sacrifice a lamb so that the angel of death will pass over their house. So that's the origins of Passover. What do Jews do to celebrate it? Well, they have a very special meal called the Seder meal. Before the festival begins, they have a big clear out of the house. Lots of people asking me to write notes. Again, I keep getting distracted by talking too much and then I forget to write notes. So let me just quickly say Pesach, Passover. I'll just write some key point. Moses, sacrifice, lamb, blood, angel of death, sounds very dramatic, escape, Exodus, unleavened bread. So as they escaped, they were basically in a rush, and so they just baked bread on their backs because they were walking through the desert. They didn't bother putting yeast in there, so it didn't need to rise, so it was basically much quicker. And that is why today Jews have the Seder meal, no unleavened bread. So before the festival begins, they clear out the house, not only just tidy but also get rid of any yeast that might be remained, so there's no crumbs of anything that might potentially be have leaven in them. They will have lots of symbolic items in the meal. So the Seder meal has a Seder plate, okay, and each of the items, whether it's the egg or the bitter herbs, all have various symbolic attachments. So the eggs are symbols of new life, because effectively the Jews received a kind of new life because they were able to start again. The bitter herbs remind them of how bad slavery was, and to never forget that even though they got freedom, they were able to enjoy they had been in such a terrible situation. Okay, let's have a look. Lots of questions still coming in, tend to be mainly on Twitter now. Can you go over life after death? This is from Michaela. Life after death, judgment and resurrection, Jewish beliefs. Yes, great question. Let me start a new slide. I'll try and remember to make notes. I'm also going to remember, or try to remember, to talk a bit slower. I get told off for talking too fast. Right, life after death. So what we can say here, so Jewish beliefs about life after death. What time? It's 9 o'clock already. Crikey, we may have to think about bringing this to an end eventually. So a few key terms here. Resurrection. Now, if you say to a Christian, what does resurrection mean? They'll probably say, oh, when Jesus rose from the dead. You say that to a Jew and they're just talking about basically life after death. And I think the Hebrew term is olam haba, which basically means the life after. So what happens after a person, after their body dies, what happens? There's actually a lot of different views on this in Judaism. In fact, I think I'm going to use the opportunity to draw a diagram here to make my point a bit quicker. So let's start off when the person dies. This is meant to be a gravestone. Okay, so the person dies. What happens next? Well, even here, Jews disagree. Some believe that what happens when a person dies is they basically are buried and they kind of go into this burial place called Sheol. And that's kind of this shadowy, semi-existence kind of place of darkness and shadow, but not really a conscious existence, not really a heaven or a hell. It's just kind of a place of waiting. And some believe that everyone will wait there until the end of time, so when there is a judgment day. And at that point, eventually, there is then the opportunity that some people will go to Gan Eden. Okay, let me try using yeah, that's much better. This is where having a touch screen sort of helps. So some will go to Gan Eden, which is what Christians might refer to as heaven, whereas those who are judged unrighteous will go to Gehenna, which is what other people might refer to as hell. Okay, that's one view. This is where there's a few variations. Some, I'm going to change my colour of pen here, believe that we skip Sheol and we go straight to this decision making where the person is judged either going to heaven or hell. So some believe that there's a time where everyone goes into the ground and goes to Sheol, and then at the end of time they're all raised. There are others who say no, that doesn't happen. Straight away after you die, you're judged and you either go to heaven or to hell, okay, or to Gan Eden or to Gehenna. But then there's some other views. Some would say you are judged straight away, but then what can happen, and again I'm going to choose a different colour here to represent what's going on here. Let's go with a nice green colour. Is that you get judged and you might go straight to heaven, to Gan Eden, but you might also have to spend some time in Sheol and then go to heaven, or, my diagram's going to get very complicated here, you might, having spent some time in Sheol, actually end up going to Gehenna, or you spend some time in Sheol and then you just simply cease to exist. Okay, if you're looking at that diagram thinking that is awful, how on earth is he going to put this into a video? Yes, I'm thinking the same thing. There are lots of variations on this belief in life after death for Jewish people, and the reason because the Torah doesn't really talk about it very much. So because there's not a huge amount of specific information there, you can't really set it aside and say this is definitely what's going to happen. So there's various ideas about whether people have to spend a time waiting before they go to heaven in Sheol. Some talk about that only being a maximum of a year. Some saying that that's just a temporary stopping point on the way to heaven. Some would say actually you can go there before going to hell. And then there's some who say you go there and then you just cease to exist if you don't end up going to heaven. So pretty confusing, I'm afraid. I like to see that as a positive thing, because if you get a question saying what do Jews believe about life after death, you can say almost any combination of those, and technically as long as you say some Jews think this, then technically you are probably right, or at least hopefully on the right track. Okay, Gehenna, Becky, if just in case you're asking me, seeing that on the live chat, is basically a place of eternal suffering. Okay, let's go back to the phone. Let's see what's going on Twitter. See if we've got any more questions. Jewish festivals, Josephine, I did that a little bit ago. You might need to rewind on the video when you get back. Mr. Gold asks, can you talk about you've spelt it Pikash Nefesh. I assume you mean Pikuach Nefesh. Again, Hebrew pronunciation, I have no idea. And sanctity of life. Everyone seems to remember Pikuach Nefesh. I think it's partly just because it sounds like a very cool word, even though I'm not sure it is. So I think the reason it's part of the concept of the sanctity of life. Now, sanctity of life, its meaning is the same as it is for Christians. So all human life is sacred and deserves to be protected. Now, how you apply that in different situations can vary, you know, since all Jews accept the sanctity of life, but some will still say, well, I think when it comes to things like abortion or euthanasia, it should be up to the person affected and what they want and that sort of stuff. Or there'll be those who say, no, it means that you can't play God and it's up to God to decide who lives, who dies. The Pikuach Nefesh is an interesting kind of not alternative, but something you don't get within Christianity. For those of you who've studied this from a Christian point of view, it is a very specifically Jewish idea. And what it basically says is, and I'll put this up here, Pikuach Nefesh says, other Jewish laws can sometimes be broken if a life is at stake. Okay, so a good example, Jewish Shabbat laws say you shouldn't work on Shabbat. If you're a doctor, you should be at home, enjoying time with your family, eating a Shabbat meal, and so on, and going to the synagogue. But if you're a Jewish doctor who's walking home from the synagogue and you see someone who's collapsed on the side of the road and in need of medical assistance, and they're likely in danger, you are allowed, by the principle of Pikuach Nefesh, to go and help them, because it is the idea that their law about saving someone's life is more important than any of those other laws in that temporary situation. So that's what Pikuach Nefesh means. Right, let's have a look at some more questions. Messiah. So Hannah asks, could you go over the Messiah? So very good question. Let me just briefly bring up a new slide. Messiah. That's just reminded me, really important thing I need to cover on the next slide. I'm going to put this about a question they can ask about British. I'll just put UK there. That'll remind myself. So we're looking at Messiah. So Messiah in Hebrew literally means anointed one. Okay, or person sent with God's anointing or God's blessing. In other words, someone that God has sent to do something incredible. Okay, so it's more than just a prophet. It's not just someone who's bringing a message, but someone who comes with God's blessing. You might even add to that God's authority or God's power, although that might be more than some Jews would be happy to accept. There's a variety of views within Judaism. The kind of traditional Orthodox view, okay, is that the Messiah will be an actual person. So he's not just a metaphor. He's not, just an idea or a symbolic meaning. He's an actual person who will, at some point, come to earth to bring peace. Okay, and there are lots of prophecies or descriptions of that person in the Old Testament. Sorry, I shouldn't say Old Testament. In the Torah or in the Tanakh, which describe him. And one of the most common descriptions is the fact that this person will be a descendant of David. Okay, that the Messiah will come from David's line. And some even say that in every generation there is a person with the potential to be the Messiah, which leaves over the possibility that actually it's not that there's one person who's already been pre-chosen to do it, but actually anyone could potentially fulfill that role if they chose to kind of fulfill it, if that makes sense. Less traditional, kind of progressive Jews sometimes think of the Messiah as a kind of figure, not figure of speech, but a kind of, I guess, a symbolic idea, and they would be more likely to use the term messianic age. They would say actually what's meant to happen is not that there's some one person who's going to come and solve everything for us, but rather we as human beings must solve it, and if we work together, working together, we can create a time of peace by kind of human cooperation. Okay, and that's what they would call the Messianic age. So that actually there will be some kind of golden age in the future where finally we'll get rid of corruption and we'll start treating our fellow human beings, as they deserve, and that will then lead to the kind of getting rid of sin and destruction, all things that make the world a bad place. By contrast, an Orthodox Jew would say the Messianic age is simply the age, the era that will be ushered in when the Messiah, this actual person, turns up and kind of puts everything into action. Okay, just going to take another quick sip. Okay, right, going to just see. Oh, here we go. Food laws. Someone, Lois, has asked about the food laws. So, yes, let's... Oh, no, sorry. I said I'd go back and do the question about the UK. Right, this is what I must particularly remember. So, you may see a phrase tomorrow that says something like this. Okay, so there's could be a question, and if it does come up, it will be probably a 4-mark question, and it will say something close to compare the view of Judaism. Okay, in fact, I'm going to write this down. Compare the view of Judaism, or the beliefs of Judaism, with the main religious tradition of Great Britain on the topic of ... Okay, so there's this question that they've told us will come up at some point, maybe this year, maybe not until next year, and they will ask you, and they will say, compare the view of Judaism with the main religious tradition of Great Britain on the topic of, and there are 3 topics they can choose from. Okay, this is the only ones they can choose here. They can either say monotheism, or they can say God as creator, or they can say Messiah. Okay, these are the only 3 topics that they can do this with. What they are asking you to do is to show that you know that the main religious tradition of Great Britain is Christianity. Okay, so you must, absolutely must, in your answer, let me write this down below, you must mention Christianity by name. Okay, if you don't do that, if you don't explicitly say, I know that the main religious tradition in Great Britain is Christianity, you're not going to get any marks for this particular question. Okay, so you must mention Christianity by name. Okay, so that's the first thing you do. Say, I'm going to compare the view of Judaism and Christianity on, and then they're going to give you these 3 topics. Now, monotheism and God as creator. Okay, Christians and Jews have the same or rather similar views. Okay, so Christians and Jews both agree in the belief in one God. So they are both monotheists. Okay, they also both agree that God is the creator. Okay, that God is the one responsible for the creation of the universe and he exists outside of the universe. They disagree on the topic of Messiah. Okay, they disagree on the topic of Messiah. So I'm going to highlight this in a different colour, and they have different views on that. Okay, just going to select different coloured pen. So on this one they disagree. So what does that mean? If you get this question tomorrow and they say compare the view of Judaism with the main religious tradition of Great Britain on monotheism, your answer will say something like Jews and Christians both agree that there is one God. Okay, and you would then develop that and take 2 aspects of it. So you could say they both agree that God is omnipotent. They both agree God is transcendent. Okay, those are ideas tied up with that idea. If they ask, compare the view of Judaism with the view of the main religious tradition of Great Britain on the topic of God as creator, you would do the same thing. Jews and Christians agree that God created the world. They both agree that God is outside of the universe because he is transcendent, and so on. If the question says, compare the view of Judaism with the main religious tradition of Great Britain on the topic of Messiah, you would then say, Jews and Christians do not agree on the Messiah. Jews believe ... that the Messiah has yet to come, or that the Messiah will be when there is a messianic age of peace and everyone works together. Christians, by contrast, believe that the Messiah has already been and he is Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, so that question, they have told us that's the phrasing that they will use, and I would be very surprised if this didn't come up in tomorrow's paper. I'd be very surprised for them to say you're going to have a question like this and then to not put it in. Okay, right. Let's have a look. I think we're just starting to flag. To be honest, I can't see the statistics for the video at the moment, so I don't actually know how many people are still watching us or still joining in. I get the sense that things are slowing down a bit on the live chat and also on Twitter, so I get the sense we're kind of coming into a landing now, so we're probably just aiming for a few more questions. So if you have got questions, either send them to me here on Twitter or put them on the live chat, although if you definitely want me to see them, you might need to put them on super chat. So let's see what we can go for the last few questions on Judaism. Just going to refresh this. So, food laws. Lois, I said I was going to do food laws. Let's quickly do that. That may be one of the last questions we do. So, food laws. You probably know that Jews eat food that is kosher. Okay. This basically mainly applies to meat, so certain animals are not kosher, the most obvious example being pig or pork, which is non-kosher. Even if there is an animal that is kosher, such as a cow, the animal must be killed and the meat treated in the correct way to keep it kosher. So it traditionally has to be killed by having its jugular vein cut so that it dies relatively quickly. The blood then has to be drained out of the meat completely. That's something that's normally done by the way the meat is hung, and then also putting salt on it to draw out the blood. If all of those things are done, then the meat remains kosher and can be eaten. Other big thing is that they also separate meat and dairy. So if I had something like some beef, as long as let's say I made a beef burger, it would be, assuming I've had it killed in the right way and it was treated the right way, then it would be kosher. But if I then put cheese on it, which is a dairy product, it would not be kosher. I have to separate meat and dairy. What is the significance of this? Well, for many Jews, it is a way of worshipping God in their day-to-day life. It's a way of showing obedience to God, saying, God, you said I should do this, so every time I prepare a meal or think about what I'm going to eat, I am considering you, and I'm considering your laws, and I'm obeying your laws. It obviously, I imagine, is quite difficult. So in a Jewish home, if they follow the kosher laws accurately or fully, then they would have Jewish home would have separate would basically have a kind of a split kitchen. Everything in the kitchen, there would be a dairy side and a meat side, so that none of the utensils or kind of different elements are shared between the two. Okay, I definitely think things are starting to slow down. Dominic, you've asked about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. You'll need to wait till the video is finished, then go back. I did cover that earlier, so you'll need to find that. I'm not going to repeat that. And I think, yes, I think lots of the questions that are coming in I've already done. I think I'm going to temporarily take a break there. It's 9:20. I'm hoping this second part of the live stream seems to get a better quality, well, not better quality of picture, but certainly a better stability of signal, so I don't think it was dropping out for many people. I think I'm going to stop there for the moment. What I will do is I'm going to take a break. I need to have a drink, get something to eat. What I will do is, if I'm still getting lots of questions on my Twitter in 15-20 minutes time, I may just start up another live stream very quickly just to answer those last few questions that you may have. But I imagine not all of you will want to stick around for that, so please, best of luck with the rest of your revision. Best of luck in the exam tomorrow. I hope it goes absolutely fantastically for you. If you want to send me a message afterwards to you know, either berate me because I didn't cover the question that I should have done, or congratulate me because I gave you some help on a question, that would be absolutely great. Otherwise, hopefully you'll do well in the exam, and that will be it. So like I said, I'm going to sign off now. If in 20 minutes I'm still getting lots of questions and demand from people to come back, then I may just do a quick follow-up session with some Q&A. But other than that, I hope you've had a nice time watching. If you felt like showing your appreciation, if you felt like this was worth doing, and you wanted to do a kind of super chat, as I said, please feel free. Any money that is raised will be going towards my football team. So yes, that will be the way it goes. So if you want to do that, please feel free. Obviously, that's not the reason. No teacher goes into teaching to get money, but that's how it goes. Right. Okay, see you later. Hope you've enjoyed it, and maybe see you in a little while for the kind of final live stream. Okay, and I'm just going to click across here. I'm going to commentate on what I'm doing until this actually stops streaming. Here we go. There we are. Click that.